A Wireless Message by Ambrose Bierce. In the summer of 1896, Mr. William Holt, a wealthy manufacturer of Chicago, was living temporarily in a little town of central New York, the name of which the writer's memory has not retained. Mr. Holt had trouble with his wife, from whom he had parted a year before. Whether the trouble was anything more serious than incompatibility of temper, he is probably the only living person that knows. He is not addicted to the vice of confidences. Yet he has related the incident herein set down to at least one person without extracting a pledge of secrecy. He is now living in Europe. One evening he had left the house of a brother whom he was visiting, for a stroll in the country. It may be assumed, whatever the value of the assumption in connection with what was said to have occurred, that his mind was occupied with reflections on his domestic infidelities and the distressing changes that they had wrought in his life. Whatever may have been his thoughts, they so possessed him that he observed neither the lapse of time nor whither his feet were carrying him. He knew only that he had passed far beyond the town limits and was traversing a lonely region by a road which bore no resemblance to the one by which he left the village. In brief, he was lost. Realizing his mischance, he smiled. Central New York is not a region of perils, nor does one long remain lost in it. He turned about and went back the way he had come. Before he had gone far, he observed that the landscape was growing more distinct, was brightening. Everything was suffused with a soft red glow, in which he saw his shadow projected on the road before him. "The moon is rising," he said to himself. Then he remembered that it was about the time of the new moon, and if that tricksy orb was in one of its stages of visibility, it had set long before. He stopped and faced about, seeking the source of the rapidly broadening light. As he did so, his shadow turned and lay along the road in front of him as before. The light still came from behind him. That was surprising. He could not understand. Again he turned, and again, facing successively to every point of the horizon. Always the shadow was before, always the light behind, a still and awful red. Holt was astonished. Dumbfounded is the word that he used in telling it, yet seems to have retained a certain intelligent curiosity. To test the intensity of the light, whose nature and cause he could not determine, he took out his watch to see if he could make out the figures on the dial. They were plainly visible, and the hands indicated the hour of 11 o'clock and 25 minutes. At that moment, the mysterious illumination suddenly flared into an intense and almost blinding splendor, flushing the entire sky, exhausting the stars, and throwing the monstrous shadow of himself athwart the landscape. In that unearthly illumination, he saw near him, but apparently in the air at a considerable elevation, the figure of his wife, clad in her night clothing, and holding to her breast the figure of his child. Her eyes were fixed upon his with an expression which he afterward professed himself unable to name or describe, further than it was not of this life. The flare was momentary, followed by black darkness, in which, however, the apparition still showed white and motionless. Then, by insensible degrees, it faded and vanished, like a bright image on the retina after the closing of the eyes. A peculiarity of the apparition, hardly noted at the time, but afterward recalled, was that it showed only the upper half of the woman's figure. Nothing was seen below the waist. The sudden darkness was comparative, not absolute, for gradually all the objects of his environment became again visible. In the dawn of the morning, Holt found himself entering the village at a point opposite to that which he had left it. He soon arrived at the house of his brother, who hardly knew him. He was wild-eyed, haggard, and gray as a rat. Almost incoherently, he related his night's experience. "Go to bed, my poor fellow," said his brother, "and wait. We shall hear more of this." An hour later came the predestined telegram. Holt's dwelling in one of the suburbs of Chicago had been destroyed by fire. Her escape cut off by the flames, his wife had appeared in an upper window, her child in her arms. There she had stood, motionless, apparently dazed. Just as the fireman had arrived with a ladder, the floor had given way, and she was seen no more. The moment of this culminating horror was 11 o'clock and 25 minutes, Standard Time. The Night Rider, by August W. Dearlith, from Weird Tales, January 1927. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Dale Grothman. A Short Ghost Story, The Night Rider, by August W. Dearlith. "Up, Madonna!" There was a silence. "Bah! The old crone has fallen asleep." Monsieur Morini rose, walked over to the sleeper, and shook her vehemently. "Up, Madonna Lucrezia, up!" Eh? What is it, Monsieur Morini?" "Up, Madonna, can you not hear the hoof-beats of some rider in the distance on the highway?" "You dream, monsieur, there is nothing. Away with you, let me sleep." He moved away, grumbling. Madonna Lucrezia's head sank back upon her breast, and she drowsed. Monsieur Morini vanished through the heavy curtains at one extremity of the room. He walked through the ill-lighted passageway to where a heavily paneled door loomed before him. He unlatched the door and walked quietly out into the still summer night, through the court to the iron paling separating him from the highway, which stretched itself far into the distance on either side, a ghastly white in the moonlight. The sound of hard riding came to him, and he stood still listening. The sound came nearer and nearer, and he wondered who rode so close to the hour of midnight. There was a low, mumbling sound behind him, and he heard the heavy door swing softly to. He turned. Madonna Lucrezia had followed him. The hoof-beats sounded nearer. He turned to the old woman at his side. "Now tell me that I was in error, Madonna." "You dream," she answered, and smothered a yawn. "Dream? Madonna? Bah! You are yet in your sleep." And he turned away and looked up the road to where he could discern a dark speck moving swiftly toward him. "There, Madonna," he indicated the rider. "There. Can you deny the evidence of your eyes?" The woman stared at him suspiciously and remained silent. "Dreaming? I dreaming? Now say that I dream, Madonna." Still the old woman did not answer. She frowned and glanced up at him, her thin, bloodless lips twisted into a sullen grimace. The rider was almost up to them. "See the superb white steed he rides, Madonna, and his wonderful silver cloak. His doublet, too, is silver, but there is a stain, as of blood, upon it. His face I cannot see. It seems a mist is before it." The rider swept by, but still the old woman said nothing, and stared at Monsieur Morini, gesticulating and pointing at the night rider, fast disappearing down the road. Monsieur Morini swore softly under his breath. "By the Madonna, but he looked like my son, my Alessandro. If it were not that I could not see his face, did he not resemble my son, Madonna?" The old woman made no answer, but turned and entered the house, crooning softly to herself. He followed her, grumbling. "Bah! The old hag walks in her sleep." In the house she sat again by the fireplace, still crooning as she watched the flames lick at the stones to the sides. Monsieur Morini sat near. "I wonder, Madonna." He lapsed into silence. The old woman chuckled a bit, but gave no hint of having heard Monsieur Morini, and went on with her crooning. "I wonder what my son could be doing riding near here. Could he have deserted the army? Or could the invader, Charles, have defeated and routed our troops? It is not likely so." He mused. It was high noon. The hot sun beat down upon the court, wilting even the blades of grass. Monsieur Morini dozed in the shade of a huge tree near the iron paling. A bird chirped shrilly as it hopped merrily about on the sundial nearby. No breath of air stirred the leaves above Monsieur Morini's head. Suddenly in the distance clattered the hooves, resounding in the courtyard. The bird ceased its chirping and stood quite still in the shadow of the dial. Monsieur Morini raised his head. A breath of air came and rustled the leaves of the tree. The hoofbeats sounded louder. From somewhere in the house came a muffled sound. The horseman came nearer. Monsieur Morini rose and leaned over the gate to stare up the road. A sharp edge caught and tore his doublet a little. Madonna Lucrezia stood in the doorway. The rider appeared up the road. The bird on the sundial flew up into the tree and hid itself among the leaves. Madonna Lucrezia moved forward and took her stand at Monsieur Morini's side. The rider came on, slackening his pace as he approached the two leaning over the gate. "He is of the army," Monsieur Morini whispered. Madonna Lucrezia grunted in reply. The horseman pulled to a stop before the two. "Ho, monsieur! This is the house of Monsieur Morini?" "You address him." "I am instructed to inform you that your son, Alessandro, was killed last night just before the midnight hour, in an encounter with the invading Charles. He received a poignard stab in the breast." He bowed to Monsieur Morini and put the spurs to his horse, and turned away in a cloud of dust. "My son, Alessandro, dead?" Monsieur Morini shook his fist at the fast-vanishing figure. "Bearer of ill tidings, a curse on you!" He turned to the woman. "You heard him, Madonna?" The old woman nodded assent. I heard him. I would have sworn it was my son who rode last night." The woman turned on him. "You were mad last night, Monsieur Morini." "How mad?" "Mad! For a while you pointed, gesticulated, shouted descriptions into my ears of some writer who you affirmed passed. I neither heard nor saw a solitary living thing on the road. And she moved toward the house, chuckling. Read by Dale Grothman. A short ghost story, The Sleepers, by August W. Dearlith. That story, began the man with the gold spectacles, crossing his legs, reminds me of an odd incident that befell me just last year. The other three men moved closer around the fireplace and looked over at him expectantly. The man with the gold spectacles repeated his statement. Unnoticed by them, a thin little man clad in a blue suit with brass buttons slid into the fifth seat somewhere back in the shadows. The inquisitive flames in the fireplace leapt higher to light up the face of the newcomer, but the effort was too much for them, and they sank back, exhausted. The four men did not see him. It was last summer. I was, at the time, in Hollywood working with the director of my latest book, which was being filmed, when my publisher in Chicago wired me to come to him at once. The matter was urgent, he stated. Somewhat testily, I wired back that I would come immediately. The train I took was the Midnight Express. When I called for my ticket, every Pullman was filled to capacity. Certainly, though, I am not going to be cheated out of a night's rest merely because the Pullman cars are all filled to capacity. So I clamored loudly for a Pullman. I was not alone in my demand, for a pompous salesman, who had purchased his ticket after I had procured mine, added his voice to mine. At length another Pullman was added. Had it not been for the hullabaloo the salesman and I raised, the incident I am about to relate would never have happened. It being shortly after midnight, I wanted to retire. I left the salesman smoking out in the rear platform of our car, and I went into the extra Pullman. My berth was lower 7, and I went directly over to that number and pulled the curtains aside. But I shut them again as quickly as I had opened them, for a man lay in my berth, sleeping peacefully. I was indignant that the officials should cause such an error. I called for the porter, who came in as fast as his sleeping feet could carry him. Said I, when the Negro came abreast of me, "Sam, there's a man in my berth." He grinned foolishly and pulled the curtain slightly aside. "Indeed, sir. Indeed they is. Very unfortunate, sir. But that's a fact." "Sam," I answered, "go and get me a Pullman conductor, and don't you dare come back without him." "Indeed I will, sir." After what seemed a wholly unnecessary interval, Sam returned with the Pullman conductor. When the conductor stepped into the car, he asked, "Are you McCarthy?" "Yes," I said, "I'm McCarthy." "H.P. McCarthy?" "Yes," I said again, "H.P. McCarthy." He came up to me. "Sam tells me that you claim that your berth is occupied. Lower 7 is assigned to H.P. McCarthy, and to no one else. As a matter of fact, there are only 2 people in this extra car. You and a salesman, C.E. Swears." "Is that right?" said I. It annoyed me that the conductor took so much for granted. He had never even peeped into the berth, and already he was turning to go. "Just a minute. Mr. Swears is out on the platform. Mr. McCarthy is right here, yours truly. And I say that there's a man in lower 7. And I pulled aside the curtain, and the conductor looked in, and saw the man there. It wounded his pride to find that he was wrong, and so he called loudly to the sleeping man. But the man didn't move. So he went over to him and reached his hand in to shake the sleeper. Now, I couldn't see what happened, but I was staring right into the conductor's face, and I saw his expression change so rapidly that I thought he was going to faint. His face went white altogether. He pulled his hand out quickly, as if he had been touching a hot iron, and then he pushed the curtains wide apart to admit as much light as possible. Then he looked in again. All the time, I could see the man lying there in the light admitted by the widely open curtains. I said nothing. He turned to me and pointed at the sleeper. "McCarthy, reach in there and touch him." I thought it was an odd request, but I did it. And I'll wager any amount that my face went as white as his did. For I swear that I saw that man there with the coverlet turned back at his shoulders. I saw that, but my hand felt the undisturbed smoothness of the coverlet. And as I looked, my hand went straight through the man. Sam left by one door as Mr. Schwiers came in by the other. The conductor and I stood in the aisle staring stupidly at the sleeper in my berth. A smothered exclamation from Schwiers caused us to turn to him. He stood before berth 3, the lower, staring at something. We knew what he would say before he said it. "There's a man in my berth." The conductor stared at him. I stared at him. He turned to the conductor. "Well, what are you going to do about it? I'm not paying for a filled berth." "Feel him," the conductor stammered. "Yes," I said, "feel him." He looked oddly at us, but obediently he reached in to feel him. And shortly, there were 3 white-faced people in the aisle of the extra Pullman, all staring stupidly at a man sleeping in a berth of a Pullman car. "By God," said the conductor with effort, "there's some mystery in this." A fact which could not have escaped the notice of any of us. He moved resolutely to berth 6 and pulled aside the curtains. And there lay a woman sleeping. And again, what we saw we could not feel. And the 3 of us made the rounds, and every berth, upper and lower, was occupied by a man, woman, or child. And we came back to berth 7 and stood there staring at the sleeper. And while we stood there, the door opened at the end of the car, and a thin little man who wore a conductor's blue suit with brass buttons walked in and looked nervously around. He had the attitude as of being summoned, and looking for whoever had summoned him. "Not so, Mr. McCarthy. The conductor had a premonition that all was not well, and he came into the Pullman to justify or destroy that premonition." It was the little man, the newcomer, who had spoken, but no one seemed to have heard him. "But we didn't stare very long," continued the man with the gold spectacles, for suddenly the thin little conductor that had entered vanished in the side of the Pullman car, and when we turned back to look at the sleepers, we saw only the unrumpled sheets on our beds. Immediately the conductor rushed out into the rear platform. Mr. Schwiers and I followed him. We were going round the famous horseshoe curve. The country was all radiant in the bright moonlight. The conductor turned to us. "Do either of you know what happened at this spot 1 year ago today?" "No," said Schwiers. "I can't think of anything." I, too, was forced to shake my head. "What?" returned the conductor. "Have both of you forgotten the famous Midnight Express wreck of late August 7? Of course we hadn't. It happened on that spot just a little way back there in the moonlight, on the night just like this. 77 people died in that wreck. This car is one that was salvaged from the wreckage and was rebuilt. This is its first trip in its rebuilt form." "But people in the berths?" interrupted Schwiers. "Yes, those people in the berths. You notice they all disappeared on the spot of the accident, didn't they? Well, figure it out for yourselves, gentlemen. And with that he went back to his post. And that's what I say to you, gentlemen. Figure it all out for yourselves. Were those sleepers, or weren't they? For my part, I am convinced. There was a meditative silence. Then the man with the gold spectacles spoke again. By the way, didn't one of you gentlemen say something about a premonition the phantom conductor had? I thought someone said something about it, but as I recollect the accident, the conductor was killed at once, so you couldn't possibly know how he felt before the accident. Didn't anyone say something? And all of the men turned to the fifth chair, upon which the thin little man in the faded blue conductor's suit with brass buttons had been sitting. There was no answer, and the firelight flickered on the bolt of the locked door. The Turret Room by August W. Derleth. Lord Alving stopped in the act of lighting his cheroot. He turned slowly toward the Earl of Kent, loudly addressing a small group about him. He smiled quizzically and spoke. "I say, old fellow," said Lord Alving, "are you quite certain of the element of truth in everything you say?" The conversation stopped, automatically it seemed. The Earl of Kent raised his eyebrows in a mocking, serious gesture. Lord Alving remained silent, the unlighted cheroot in his hand. "For instance, what, Alving?" "The exact words were these, I believe. Ghosts, balderdash, poppycock." He paused. "You said that, didn't you?" "Yes, I believe I did." "And you meant it?" "Of course, Alving." The ladies had stopped bridge and stood about in a small circle. Lady Montrose idly stirred a cup of tea. Lady Alving had come away from her table with a royal flush in her hand. The Duke of Gloucester stood looking at it in a small silence. "You believe every word of it, too, old man?" "Yes, I do." "Then let me tell you something that happened to me about 7 years ago at the Duke of Gloucester's castle. There was rather an excellent crowd. Trust the Duke to make a pleasing selection. We were gathered about the dining table one evening, and somehow we began to talk about the supernatural. We were rather amused at some of the theories of our lodge, of Lambrosco, and of Flammarion. The Duke didn't say much, he just sat and listened. Nor did he say anything until the conversation began to lag. Then suddenly he said, 'It may interest you to know that the turret room of the center tower of my castle is supposed to be haunted.' 'Not really,' chorused several of us. But he was perfectly serious. I have never seen him more so. Several of the company turned to the Duke of Gloucester. His smile verified Lord Alving's statement. 'Do you mean to say,' said I, 'that if I spent a night in the turret room I'd see a ghost?' 'I see no reason why you shouldn't,' he replied immediately. Without hesitation I said, 'I'll spend tonight there. It'll take an unusual manifestation to scare me out.' The Duke protested, but I persisted. At length he gave in. I wanted to be shown right up. I could hardly wait. On the stairs I turned and shouted down, 'If I see a ghost, you'll all hear about it.' 'And if you don't?' came from someone below. 'All of you remember Harry Longworth, the poet, don't you?' I was sure that you did. Harry was there, and Harry shouted back, 'And if you don't, I'll send one up to you.' Everyone laughed, and I followed the servant up to the haunted room. There is nothing conspicuous about the room, except perhaps the dust. The room had never been used. The mere thought of a spectre will scare people away very easily, it seems. The moonlight streamed in through the latticed window. I brushed the dust from one of the antique chairs and sat down. All of you know that the Duke tolls the hours with his ancient alarm bell. I had come into the turret room as the bell tolled 10 o'clock. I sat patiently, waiting for some supernatural manifestation, until somewhere after 12. I was disappointed, very much so. I had almost expected to see some long-dead cavaliers fight a duel before my eyes, or some atrocious murder committed. I allowed myself to go to sleep. The alarm bell was tolling 2 when I woke up. I had a queer feeling. I knew that there was someone else in the room. The patch of moonlight had moved considerably, and now fell aslant the dust-covered bed. On the edge of the bed, in the moonlight, sat Harry, grinning foolishly. I had completely forgotten him. "Sap," I said, "do you want to scare me to death?" He kept right on grinning. "Lucky you came up, though," I continued. "It has become odiously monotonous up here." He nodded a little and grinned some more. "Haven't got a deck of cards with you, have you?" I asked. He shook his head. I walked over to the window and looked out. There was a beautiful view. "Fine view, Harry. Come here." But he didn't come, and when I turned around, he had gone. I supposed he had gone for a deck of cards, and I waited accordingly. He didn't come back. In the morning I told the Duke what I thought of his haunted room. I told him that all I had seen was Harry. He looked as if you could have knocked him over with a feather. He's not so small, either. Lord Alving slowly lifted the cheroot he had been holding. "And what does that make of my idea of ghosts, Alving?" asked the Earl of Kent, smiling. "Where does the ghost part come in?" asked the Duchess of York. "Yes," said Lady Montrose. "Where is the ghost?" "It doesn't prove anything to me, Alving," said the Earl of Kent. "No, it didn't to me either until the Duke of Gloucester told me that Harry had died between 1 and 2 in the morning of a sudden stroke of apoplexy."
An Egyptian Hornet by Algernon Blackwood. The word has an angry, malignant sound that brings the idea of attack vividly into the mind. There is a vicious sting about it somewhere. Even a foreigner, ignorant of the meaning, must feel it. A hornet is wicked. It darts and stabs. It pierces, aiming without provocation for the face and eyes. The name suggests a metallic droning of evil wings, fierce flight, and poisonous assault. Though black and yellow, it sounds scarlet. There is blood in it. A striped tiger of the air in concentrated form. There is no escape if it attacks. In Egypt, an ordinary bee is the size of an English hornet, but the Egyptian hornet is enormous. It is truly monstrous, an ominous, dying terror. It shares that universal quality of the land of the Sphinx and pyramids, great size. It is a formidable insect, worse than scorpion or tarantula. The Reverend James Milligan, meeting one for the first time, realized the meaning of another word as well, a word he used prolifically in his eloquent sermons: devil. One morning in April, when the heat began to bring the insects out, he rose as usual betimes and went across the wide stone corridor to his bath. The desert already glared in through the open windows. The heat would be afflicting later in the day, but at this early hour the cool north wind blew pleasantly down the hotel passages. It was Sunday, and at 8:30 he would appear to conduct the morning service for the English visitors. The floor of the passageway was cold beneath his feet in their thin native slippers of bright yellow. He was neither young nor old. His salary was comfortable. He had a competency of his own, without wife or children to absorb it. The dry climate had been recommended to him, and the big hotel took him in for next to nothing. And he was thoroughly pleased with himself, for he was a sleek, vain, pompous, well-advertised personality, but mean as a rat. No worries of any kind were on his mind as, carrying sponge and towel, scented soap, and a bottle of Scrubb's ammonia, he travelled amiably across the deserted, shining corridor to the bathroom. And nothing went wrong with the Reverend James Milligan until he opened the door, and his eye fell upon a dark, suspicious-looking object clinging to the window-pane in front of him. And even then, at first, he felt no anxiety or alarm, but merely a natural curiosity to know exactly what it was, this little clot of an odd-shaped, elongated thing that stuck there on the wooden framework, 6 feet before his aquiline nose. He went straight up to it to see, then stopped dead. His heart gave a distinct, unclerical leap. His lips formed themselves into unregenerate shape. He gasped, "Good God, what is it?" For something unholy, something wicked as a secret sin, stuck there before his eyes in the patch of blazing sunshine. He caught his breath. For a moment he was unable to move, as though the sight half fascinated him. Then, cautiously and very slowly, stealthily in fact, he withdrew towards the door he had just entered. Fearful of making the smallest sound, he retraced his steps on tiptoe. His yellow slippers shuffled. His dry sponge fell, and bounded till it settled, rolling close beneath the horribly attractive object facing him. From the safety of the open door, with ample space for retreat behind him, he paused and stared. His entire being focused itself in his eyes. It was a hornet that he saw. It hung there, motionless and threatening, between him and the bathroom door. And at first he merely exclaimed, below his breath, "Good God, it's an Egyptian hornet!" Being a man with a reputation for decided action, however, he soon recovered himself. He was well schooled in self-control. When people left his church at the beginning of the sermon, no muscle of his face betrayed the wounded vanity and annoyance that burned deep in his heart. But a hornet sitting directly in his path was a very different matter. He realized in a flash that he was poorly clothed. In a word, that he was practically half naked. From a distance he examined this intrusion of the devil. It was calm and very still. It was wonderfully made, both before and behind. Its wings were folded upon its terrible body. Long sinuous things, pointed like temptation, barbed as well, stuck out of it. There was poison and yet grace in its exquisite presentment. Its shiny black was beautiful, and the yellow stripes upon its sleek, curved abdomen were like the gleaming ornaments upon some feminine body of the seductive world he preached against. Almost he saw an abandoned dancer on the stage. And then, swiftly in his impressionable soul, the simile changed, and he saw instead more blunt and aggressive forms of destruction. The well-filled body, tapering to a horrid point, reminded him of those perfect engines of death that reduce hundreds to annihilation unawares. Torpedoes, shells, projectiles, crammed with secret, desolating powers. Its wings, its awful, quiet head, its delicate, slim waist, its stripes of brilliant saffron, all these seemed the concentrated prototype of abominations made cleverly by the brain of man, and beautifully painted to disguise their invisible freight of cruel death. "Bah!" he exclaimed, ashamed of his prolific imagination. "It's only a hornet after all, an insect." And he contrived a hurried, careful plan. He aimed a towel at it, rolled up into a ball, but did not throw it. He might miss. He remembered that his ankles were unprotected. Instead, he paused again, examining the black and yellow object in safe retirement near the door, as one day he hoped to watch the world in leisurely retirement in the country. It did not move. It was fixed and terrible. It made no sound. Its wings were folded. Not even the black antennae, blunt at the tips like clubs, showed the least stir or tremble. It breathed, however. He watched the rise and fall of the evil body. It breathed air in and out as he himself did. The creature, he realized, had lungs and heart and organs. It had a brain. Its mind was active all this time. It knew it was being watched. It merely waited. Any second, with a whiz of fury and with perfect accuracy of aim, it might dart at him and strike. If he threw the towel and missed, it certainly would. There were other occupants of the corridor, however, and a sound of steps approaching gave him the decision to act. He would lose his bath if he hesitated much longer. He felt ashamed of his timidity, though pusillanimity was the word thought selected, owing to the pulpit vocabulary it was his habit to prefer. He went with extreme caution towards the bathroom door, passing the point of danger so close that his skin turned hot and cold. With one foot gingerly extended, he recovered his sponge. The hornet did not move a muscle. But it had seen him pass. It merely waited. All dangerous insects had that trick. It knew quite well he was inside. It knew quite well he must come out a few minutes later. It also knew quite well that he was naked. Once inside the little room, he closed the door with exceeding gentleness, lest the vibration might stir the fearful insect to attack. The bath was already filled, and he plunged to his neck with a feeling of comparative security. A window into the outside passage he also closed, so that nothing could possibly come in. And steam soon charged the air and left its blurred deposit on the glass. For 10 minutes he could enjoy himself and pretend that he was safe. For 10 minutes he did so. He behaved carelessly, as though nothing mattered, and as though all the courage in the world were his. He splashed and soaped and sponged, making a lot of reckless noise. He got out and dried himself. Slowly the steam subsided. The air grew clearer. He put on dressing gown and slippers. It was time to go out. Unable to devise any further reason for delay, he opened the door softly 1/2 inch, peeped out, and instantly closed it again with a resounding bang. He had heard a drone of wings. The insect had left its perch and now buzzed upon the floor directly in his path. The air seemed full of stings. He felt stabs all over him. His unprotected portions winced with the expectancy of pain. The beast knew he was coming out and was waiting for him. In that brief instant he had felt its sting all over him, on his unprotected ankles, on his back, his neck, his cheeks, in his eyes, and on the bald clearing that adorned his Anglican head. Through the closed door he heard the ominous dull murmur of his striped adversary as it beat its angry wings. Its oiled and wicked sting shot in and out with fury. Its deft legs worked. He saw its tiny waist already writhing with the lust of battle. Ugh! That tiny waist! A moment's steady nerve, and he could have severed that cunning body from the directing brain with one swift, well-directed thrust. But his nerve had utterly deserted him. Human motives, even in the professedly holy, are an involved affair at any time. Just now, in the Reverend James Milligan, they were quite inextricably mixed. He claims this explanation, at any rate, in excuse of his abominable subsequent behavior. For, exactly at this moment, when he had decided to admit cowardice by ringing for the Arab servant, a step was audible in the corridor outside, and courage came with it into his disreputable heart. It was the step of the man he cordially disapproved of, using the pulpit version of hated and despised. He had overstayed his time, and the bath was in demand by Mr. Mullins. Mr. Mullins invariably followed him at 7:30. It was now 7:45, and Mr. Mullins was a wretched drinking man, a sot. In a flash the plan was conceived and put into execution. The temptation, of course, was of the devil. Mr. Milligan hid the motive from himself, pretending he hardly recognized it. The plan was what men call a dirty trick. It was also irresistibly seductive. He opened the door, stepped boldly, nose in the air, right over the hideous insect on the floor, and fairly pranced into the outer passage. The brief transit brought 100 horrible sensations: that the hornet would rise and sting his leg, that it would cling to his dressing-gown and stab his spine, that he would step upon it and die like Achilles of a heel exposed. But with these, and conquering them, was one other stronger emotion that robbed the lesser terrors of their potency: that Mr. Mullins would run precisely the same risks 5 seconds later, unprepared. He heard the gloating insect buzz and scratch the oilcloth. But it was behind him. He was safe. "Good morning to you, Mr. Mullins," he observed with a gracious smile. "I trust I have not kept you waiting." "Mornin'," grunted Mullins sourly in reply, as he passed him with a distinctly hostile and contemptuous air. For Mullins, though depraved, perhaps, was an honest man, abhorring parsons and making no secret of his opinions, whence the bitter feeling. All men, except those very big ones who are supermen, have something astonishingly despicable in them. The despicable thing in Milligan came uppermost now. He fairly chuckled. He met the snub with a calm, forgiving smile, and continued his shambling gait with what dignity he could towards his bedroom opposite. Then he turned his head to see. His enemy would meet an infuriated hornet, an Egyptian hornet, and might not notice it. He might step on it. He might not. But he was bound to disturb it and rouse it to attack. The chances were enormously on the clerical side, and its sting meant death. "May God forgive me," ran subconsciously through his mind, and side by side with the repentant prayer ran also a recognition of the tempter's eternal skill. "I hope the devil it will sting him." It happened very quickly. The Reverend James Milligan lingered a moment by his door to watch. He saw Mullins, the disgusting Mullins, step blithely into the bathroom passage. He saw him pause, shrink back, and raise his arm to protect his face. He heard him swear out aloud, "What's the damned thing doing here? Have I really got him again?" And then he heard him laugh, a hearty, guffawing laugh of genuine relief. "It's real!" The moment of revulsion was overwhelming. It filled the churchly heart with anguish and bitter disappointment. For a space he hated the whole race of men. For the instant Mr. Mullins realized that the insect was not a theory illusion of his disordered nerves, he went forward without the smallest hesitation. With his towel he knocked down the flying terror. Then he stooped. He gathered up the venomous thing his well-aimed blow had stricken so easily to the floor. He advanced with it, held at arm's length, to the window. He tossed it out carelessly. The Egyptian hornet flew away uninjured, and Mr. Mullins, the Mr. Mullins who drank, gave nothing to the church, attended no services, hated parsons, and proclaimed the fact with enthusiasm, this same detestable Mr. Mullins went to his unearned bath without a scratch. But first he saw his enemy standing in the doorway across the passage, watching him, and understood. That was the awful part of it. Mullins would make a story of it, and the story would go the round of the hotel. The Reverend James Milligan, however, proved that his reputation for self-control was not undeserved. He conducted morning service half an hour later with an expression of peace upon his handsome face. He conquered all outward sign of inward spiritual vexation. The wicked, he consoled himself, ever flourish like green bay trees. It was notorious that the righteous never have any luck at all. That was bad enough. But what was worse, and the Reverend James Mulligan remembered for very long, was the superior ease with which Mullins had relegated both himself and Hornet to the same level of comparative insignificance. Mullins ignored them both, which proved that he felt himself superior. Infinitely worse than the sting of any hornet in the world. He really was superior.
The Room in the Tower by D.L. Radway. Not long ago I was stopping at an old castle in the northern part of Scotland, that land of mystic-minded people, and a certain tower in this castle, somewhat older than the other parts of the building, had for centuries been known by both the inmates and the villagers to be inhabited by ghosts. There was an old tapestry room in this tower which had not been touched or slept in within the memory of the place. However, my love of and interest in the supernatural was so strongly implanted in my nature that I implored my hostess, Lady Garvent, to allow me to sleep in this ancient tapestried room for one night at least. Accordingly, the valet transferred my baggage, shortly after my arrival that afternoon, to the apartment in the tower. It was a typical Scottish winter's night, the rain coming in driven gusts against the panes, with a howling wind with a scream in it like the voice of some unhappy banshee, and occasionally a storm of sleet driving against the windows like the rattle of artillery. Round the big fire of logs in the hall we gathered cosily, the more content to be ensconced warmly indoors for hearing the war of the elements without. My hostess expressed herself as only too pleased to be able to give me a night in the company of the family ghosts, who had happily always confined themselves strictly to the room in the tower. The conversation drifted to the weird and the supernatural, and we all started to recount ghost stories that had come within our knowledge or that of our immediate friends. I candidly confess that in a short space of time the members of the house party had got me into a thoroughly jumpy state of nerves, and I felt that really in such a place anything might happen. Then at last my hostess said, "I think it is time for us to put an end to this delightful conversation," and in saying "good night," she added, "I really do feel that I have, as it were, been communing tonight with spirits of another world than this. It is almost uncanny." Everyone was a little inclined, I thought, to joke at my expense when they realized that I seriously meant to spend my night in the haunted room, and I was laughingly escorted by the entire house party to the worn stone staircase leading to the tower in the northwest corner of the castle. We said good night, and I mounted to my room. It was furnished with the weirdest and most gruesome-looking black oak furniture it is possible to imagine, and a huge four-poster bed occupied the center of one wall and jutted well out into the room. My own home comforts were there, supplied by the thoughtful care of my manservant, but there also, on the walls above the mantelpiece and above my bed, were the uncanny weapons of a bygone generation of Scotsmen. Pieces of armor of beautiful and intricate design, doubtless of Spanish workmanship, were propped against the walls, and in one corner with most uncomfortable effect stood a suit of armor. The room in this square tower was very large. Never had I seen anything like the fireplace. So enormous was the chimney that one could almost stand upright within it, the hearth of bricks being on a level with the floor of the room. As my kind hostess had insisted on a large fire being lit on this wintry night, it was piled up with huge logs, and the room was lit up by the weird and flickering lights that come from burning wood. The only other illumination was from 4 large candles, 2 on the dressing table and 2 on the high mantelpiece. The mullioned windows, sunk deeply into the walls, over 6 feet thick, were heavily curtained with dark red velvet. Not until a door had slammed, shot to by a fiercer gust of wind than usual, which seemed to shake the very tower to its foundations, and the deeply glowing logs fell apart with terrible and startling suddenness at the same moment, did I realize that I was indeed shut out from all this ordinary world. Intensely then did I realize that I was alone, and about to enter here into the life of the unreal, the occult, which up till now had been so fascinating merely to hear about. What would the experience be like at first hand? Always supposing that the spirits of the tower would reveal themselves. The sides of this great room were hung with magnificent old tapestry, portraying scenes of the chase and the figures of huntsmen in their woodland costume, and hounds among the trees of a vast forest. It was a beautiful piece of needlework, and at another time I would have interested me greatly. But somehow, on this particular night, imagination had so played upon the chords of my mind that they jangled out of tune, so that to my fancy it seemed as though the eyes of the pictured horseman really moved and followed my movements round the ancient room. On this wild night the draught behind the tapestry caused it to sway slightly in all its length from time to time, and then the beings embroidered upon it seemed to dance and sway with it. To the accompaniment of the shrieking wind and cruel blast outside, and the loud rattling of the panes as furious gusts of rain and sleet were forced against them, I undressed quickly, preparing for the night with a sort of quivering hurry to be done with it and into bed, very foreign to my nature. And after I was between the sheets, I was actually coward enough not to wish to blow out the only candle that I had left burning. In another moment, strange as it may seem, I swear that I heard a sigh of human breath close to my head, so strong that in a flash the candle on the small table by my bed's head was extinguished, and I was left holding my very breath in the semi-darkness, with only the flickering lights and shadows from the old logs crackling and spitting in the vast old fireplace. There I lay, determined not to close my eyes for a moment, for I felt through all my being that weird events were near at hand. However, soon a sort of drowsiness against which I was powerless to fight overcame me, and I seemed, in a vision as it were, to see how a curtain at the extreme end of the room was blown slightly but unmistakably on one side by some invisible means. This drowsiness now overcame me more and more, in spite of the growing horror of the night, and I must have dropped off into unconsciousness. When I awoke, it was with a sensation that I can never forget while life lasts, of creepy chills that passed from the back of my neck up and down my spine, producing the most horrible feeling of shivering, chilliness throughout my entire body. It is beyond the power of words to describe what I felt at that moment. In another minute, when I found myself fully awake again, to my amazement and horror I saw by the light of the still faintly glowing logs on the hearth, crouching down in an indescribable heap round that great fireplace, a large and shapeless mass, covered apparently by a dingy white sheet, the dinginess of muslin yellow with age. As I gazed, lying still and motionless upon my bed, I saw that thing move with an undulating motion, and I discovered that they were separate beings lying there, all enveloped in yellowish white draperies of quaint and, to my eyes, unaccustomed material. Perhaps centuries ago, when in real life it had been worn, it was white, but now it was musty and yellow with the passing of the years. I gazed as if in a trance, and yet I know that I was fully awake. While paralyzed with horror, I felt every nerve in my body was pitched to its highest point of tension, waiting and watching eagerly to see what these beings round the fire were about to do. One moment, and to my horror the central form began to move, slowly, with a strange, wavy movement of arms and draperies quite impossible to describe, turning toward the bed on which I lie. And the next thing that caught my eye and held me transfixed was a long, tangled lock of white hair that reached to the floor as the figure moved to its feet. And as it turned, The face revealed to me, merciful heavens! Instead of a face, a grinning skull, and on the other side of the skull, too, was a long stream of white hair which reached to the floor. The great hollows of the eyes of the death's head seemed all at once to discover that a human being lay in the bed, and to smile repulsively. As I looked, all power to speak or cry for assistance, or move or turn, had gone from me. I lay there, frozen to the mattress by the sight. This awful figure raised one arm to push back its robe. I saw the hand extended, but the flesh of that hand had left those bones years before. In its skeleton fingers it held aloft to me a smoking goblet, gliding swiftly now toward the bed. Perhaps you can imagine my horror as I saw the figure gliding, creeping toward me, its death mask grinning as if with pleasure to find at last the room inhabited by a human. As I marked the eye holes of doom seeming to glow red in the firelit room, and the bony hand holding on high what I knew to be a cup of poison meant for me, my eyes fell now on the other ghostly figures. They remained stationary, all turning toward the bed, and as they raised their arms, I saw that every one held aloft a smoking goblet. The sweat was now streaming from my every pore, and as the first ghastly figure came on with the firm steps nearer to the bed on which I lay, I made absolutely sure that my last hour had struck, even that death would be preferable to the madness, the frenzy that I felt running through every vein, to the terror of knowing the unknown, of seeing those things usually unseen. A cold breath emanated from the figure as it drew close to me, until I seemed to feel the very atmosphere of the tomb. I even longed for death. Now the steam from the goblet wafted hot and heavy upon my face. I was going mad. Mad! At the other end of the room a deep-toned clock began sonorously to strike the hour of 12. With a shriek of ungovernable fright, that sound of the striking of the hour breaking the spell that held me silent, I fell back, unconscious, upon the pillows, and knew nothing whatever until the dawn arrived. With the morning, the storm had passed, and I was aroused from my lethargy by the bright cold rays of the winter sun. And as I dressed and prepared once more to mingle with the people in the surroundings of bright reality, I made a vow never again to try and penetrate into that other world, remote, mysterious, beyond the grave. Never again to show even curiosity about the life of those spirits which inhabit that world, but to leave them to the companionship of other ghosts. The Popular Story of Bluebeard by Charles Perrault. A long time ago, and at a considerable distance from any town, there lived a gentleman who was not only in possession of great riches, but of the largest estates in that part of the country. Although he had some very elegant, neat mansions on his estates, he generally resided in a magnificent castle, beautifully situated on a rising ground, surrounded with groves of the finest evergreens and other choice trees and shrubs. The inside of this fine castle was even more beautiful than the outside, for the rooms were all hung with the richest damask, curiously ornamented. The chairs and sofas were covered with the finest velvet, fringed with gold, and his table dishes and plates were either of silver or gold, finished in the most elegant style. His carriages and horses might have served a king, and perhaps were finer than any monarchs of the present day. The gentleman's appearance, however, did not altogether correspond to his wealth, for to a fierce, disagreeable countenance was added an ugly blue beard, which made him an object of fear and disgust in the neighborhood, where he usually went by the name of Bluebeard. There resided, at some considerable distance from Bluebeard's castle, an old lady and her 2 daughters, who were people of some rank but by no means wealthy. The 2 young ladies were very pretty, and the fame of their beauty having reached Bluebeard, he determined to ask one of them in marriage. Having ordered a carriage, he called at their house, where he saw the 2 young ladies, and was very politely received by their mother, with whom he begged a few moments' conversation. After the 2 young ladies left the room, he began by describing his immense riches, and then told her the purport of his visit, begging that she would use her interest in his favor. They were both so lovely, he said, that he would be happy to get either of them for his wife, and would therefore leave it to their own choice to determine upon the subject, and immediately took his leave. When the proposals of Bluebeard were mentioned to the young ladies by their mother, both Miss Anne and her sister Fatima protested that they would never marry an ugly man, and particularly one with such a frightful blue beard, because although he possessed immense riches, it was reported in the country that he had married several beautiful ladies, and nobody could tell what had become of them. Their mother said that the gentleman was agreeable in his conversation and manners, that the ugliness of his face and the blue beard were defects which they would soon be reconciled to from habit, that his immense riches would procure them every luxury their heart could desire, and he was so civil that she was certain the scandalous reports about his wives must be entirely without foundation. The 2 young ladies were as civil as they possibly could be, in order to conceal the disgust they felt at Bluebeard, and, to soften their refusal, replied to this effect: that, at present, they had no desire to change their situation, but if they had, the one sister could never think of depriving the other of so good a match, and that they did not wish to be separated. Bluebeard having called next day, the old lady told him what her daughters had said, on which he sighed deeply and pretended to be very much disappointed. But as he had the mother on his side, he still continued his visits to the family. Bluebeard, knowing the attractions that fine houses, fine furniture, and fine entertainments have on the minds of ladies in general, invited the mother, her 2 daughters, and 2 or 3 other ladies who were then on a visit to them, to spend a day or 2 with him at his castle. Bluebeard's invitation was accepted, and having spent a considerable time in arranging their wardrobe and in adorning their persons, they all set out for the splendid mansion of Bluebeard. On coming near the castle, although they had heard a great deal of the taste and expense that had been employed in decorating it, they were struck with the beauty of the trees that overshadowed the walks through which they passed, and with the fragrancy of the flowers which perfumed the air. When they reached the castle, Bluebeard, attended by a number of his servants in splendid dresses, received them with the most polite courtesy, and conducted them to a magnificent drawing-room. An elegant repast was ready in the dining-room, to which they adjourned. Here they were again astonished by the grandeur of the apartment and the elegance of the entertainment, and they felt so happy that the evening passed away before they were aware. Next day, after they had finished breakfast, the ladies proceeded to examine the pictures and furniture of the rooms that were open, and were truly astonished at the magnificence that everywhere met their view. The time rolled pleasantly away amidst a succession of the most agreeable amusements, consisting of hunting, music, dancing, and banquets, where the richest wines and most tempting delicacies in most luxurious profusion presented themselves in every direction. The party felt so agreeable amidst these scenes of festivity that they continued at the castle several days, during which the cunning Bluebeard, by every obsequious service, tried to gain the favor of his fair guests. Personal attentions, even although paid us by an ugly creature, seldom fail to make a favorable impression. It was therefore no wonder that Fatima, the youngest of the 2 sisters, began to think Bluebeard a very polite, pleasant, and civil gentleman, and that the beard, which she and her sister had been so much afraid of, was not so very blue. A short time after her return home, Fatima, who was delighted with the attention which had been paid her at the castle, told her mother that she did not now feel any objections to accept of Bluebeard as a husband. The old lady immediately communicated to him the change in her daughter's sentiments. Bluebeard, who lost no time in paying the family a visit, was in a few days privately married to the young lady, and soon after the ceremony, Fatima, accompanied by her sister, returned to the castle the wife of Bluebeard. On arriving there, they were received at the entrance by all his retinue, attired in splendid dress, and Bluebeard, after saluting his bride, led the way to an elegant entertainment where, everything that could aid to their comfort being prepared, they spent the evening in the most agreeable manner. The next day, and every succeeding day, Bluebeard always varied the amusements, and a month had passed away imperceptibly when he told his wife that he was obliged to leave her for a few weeks, as he had some affairs to transact in a distant part of the country, which required his personal attendance. "But," said he, "my dear Fatima, you may enjoy yourself in my absence in any way that will add to your happiness, and you can invite your friends to make the time pass more agreeably, for you are sole mistress in this castle. Here are the keys of the 2 large wardrobes. This is the key of the great box that contains the best plate, which we use for company. This of my strong box, where I keep my money, and this belongs to the casket in which are all my jewels. Here also is a master key to all the rooms in the house, but this small key belongs to the blue closet at the end of the long gallery on the ground floor. I give you leave," he continued, "to open or do what you like with all the rest of the castle except this closet. Now, my dear, remember you must not enter it, nor even put the key into the lock. If you do not obey me in this, expect the most dreadful of punishments." She promised him implicit obedience to his orders, and then accompanied him to the gate, where Bluebeard, after saluting her in a tender manner, stepped into the coach and drove away. When Bluebeard was gone, Fatima sent a kind invitation to her friends to come immediately to the castle, and ordered a grand entertainment to be prepared for their reception. She also sent a messenger to her 2 brothers, both officers in the army, who were quartered about 40 miles distant, requesting they would obtain leave of absence and spend a few days with her. So eager were her friends to see the apartments and the riches of Bluebeard's castle, of which they had heard so much, that in less than 2 hours after receiving notice, the whole company were assembled, with the exception of her brothers, who were not expected till the following day. As her guests had arrived long before the time appointed them for the entertainment, Fatima took them through every apartment in the castle and displayed all the wealth she had acquired by her marriage with Bluebeard. They went from room to room and from wardrobe to wardrobe, expressing fresh wonder and delight at every new object they came to. But their surprise was increased when they entered the drawing rooms and saw the grandeur of the furniture. During the day, Fatima was so much engaged that she never once thought of the blue closet which Bluebeard had ordered her not to open. But when all the visitors were gone, she felt a great curiosity to know its contents. She took out the key, which was made of the finest gold, and went to consult with her sister on the subject. Anne used every argument she could think of to dissuade Fatima from her purpose, and reminded her of the threats of Bluebeard. But all in vain, for Fatima was now bent on gratifying her curiosity. She therefore, in spite of all her sister could do, seized one of the candles and hurried downstairs to the fatal closet. On reaching the door, she stopped, and began to reason with herself on the propriety of her conduct. But her curiosity at length overcame every other consideration, and with a trembling hand she applied the key to the lock and opened the door. She had only advanced a few steps when the most frightful scene met her view, and struck with horror and dismay, she dropped the key of the closet. She was in the midst of blood, and the heads, bodies, and mutilated limbs of murdered ladies lay scattered on the floor. These ladies had all been married to Bluebeard, and had suffered for their imprudent curiosity, the key, which was the gift of a fairy, always betraying their fatal disobedience. The terror of Fatima was not diminished on observing these dreadful words on the wall. The reward of disobedience and imprudent curiosity. She trembled violently, but on recovering a little, she snatched up the key, and having again locked the door, left this abode of horror. As soon as she reached her sister's chamber, she related the whole of her horrid adventure. They then examined the key, but it was all covered with blood, and they both turned pale with fear. They spent a good part of the night in trying to clean off the blood from the key, but it was without effect, for though they washed and scoured it with brick dust and sand, no sooner was the blood removed from one side than it appeared on the other. Fatigued with their exertions, they at last retired to bed, where they passed a sleepless and anxious night. Fatima rose at a late hour next day and consulted with her sister how she ought to proceed. She thought first of escaping from the castle, but as her brothers were expected in an hour or two, she resolved to wait their arrival. A loud knock at the gate made her almost leap for joy, and she cried, "They are come! They are come!" But what was her consternation when Bluebeard hastily opened the door and entered. It was impossible for Fatima to conceal her agitation, although she pretended to be very happy at his sudden and unexpected return. Bluebeard, who guessed what she had been about, requested the keys, in order, as he said, that he might change his dress. She went to her chamber, and soon returned with the keys, all except the one belonging to the blue closet. He took the keys from her with seeming indifference, and after glancing at them minutely, said, rather sternly, "How is this, Fatima? I do not see the key of the blue closet here. Go and bring it to me instantly." The poor girl, feeling the crisis of her fate approaching, said, "I will go and search for it," and left the apartment in tears. She went straight to her sister's chamber, where they again tried, but in vain, to remove the blood from the key. The voice of Bluebeard again calling for her, she was forced to return, and reluctantly to give him the fatal key. On examining the key, Bluebeard burst into a terrible rage. "Pray, madam," said he, "how came this blood to be here?" "I am sure I do not know," replied she, trembling and turning pale. "What! Do you not know?" cried Bluebeard in a voice like thunder, which made poor Fatima start with fear. "But I know well, you have been in the forbidden blue closet, and since you are so fond of prying into secrets, you shall take up your abode with the ladies you saw there." Almost expiring with fear and terror, the trembling Fatima sunk upon her knees and implored him in the most piteous manner to forgive her, but the cruel Bluebeard, deaf to her entreaties, drew his dreadful scimitar and bid her prepare for immediate death. Bluebeard had raised his arm to give the fatal blow when a dreadful shriek from her sister, who at that moment entered the apartment, arrested his attention. She entreated him to spare the life of Fatima, but he was deaf to her intercession, and would only grant her 1/4 of an hour that she might make her peace with heaven before he put her to death. Bluebeard then dragged her up to a large hall in the top of the tower of the castle to prevent her groans being heard, to which they were followed by her sister. He then told her to make the best use of the time, as she might expect his return the moment it elapsed, and immediately left the place. When alone with her sister, Fatima felt her dreadful situation, and again burst into tears. Only 15 minutes between her and the most cruel death, without the least chance of escape. For Bluebeard had secured the door when he retired, and the staircase they saw only led to the battlements. Fatima's thoughts were now turned to her brothers, whom she expected that day, and she requested her sister to ascend to the top of the tower to see if there was any appearance of them. Fatima's sister immediately ascended to the top of the battlements, while the poor trembling girl below every minute cried out, "Sister Anne, my dear Sister Anne, do you see anyone coming yet?" Her sister always replied, "There is not a human being in view, and I see nothing but the sun and grass." She was upon her knees bewailing her fate when Bluebeard, in a tremendous voice, cried out, "Are you ready? The time is expired." And she heard the sound of his footsteps approaching. She again supplicated him to allow her 5 minutes longer to finish her prayers, which he, knowing she was completely within his power, granted her and again left her. Fatima again renewed her inquiries to her sister. "Do you see anyone coming yet?" Her sister replied, "There is not a human being within sight." When the 5 minutes were elapsed, the voice of Bluebeard was heard bawling out, "Are you ready yet?" She again beseeched him to allow her only 2 minutes more, and then addressed her sister. "Dear Anne, do you see anyone coming yet?" "I see," said her sister, "a cloud of dust rising a little to the left." In breathless agitation she cried, "Do you think it is my brothers?" "Alas, no, my dearest Fatima," returned her sister. "It is only a flock of sheep." Again the voice of Bluebeard was heard, and she begged for 1 minute longer. She then called out for the last time, "Sister Anne, do you see no one coming yet?" Her sister quickly answered, "I see 2 men on horseback, but they are still a great way off." "Thank heaven!" exclaimed Fatima. "I shall yet be saved, for it must be my 2 brothers. My dearest sister, make every signal in your power to hasten them forward, or they will be too late." Bluebeard's patience being now exhausted, he burst open the door in a rage and made a blow at the wretch's Fatima with the intention of striking off her head, but she sprang close to him and evaded it. Furious at being foiled in his aim, he threw her from him, and then, seizing her by the hair of the head, was in the act of striking her a blow with his scimitar, when the noise of persons approaching with hasty steps arrested the progress of his sanguinary arm. Bluebeard had not time to conjecture who the intruders might be, when the door opened and 2 officers with their swords drawn rushed into the apartment. Struck with terror, the guilty wretch released his wife from his grasp, and without attempting to resist, he tried to effect his escape from the resentment of her brothers. But they pursued and seized him before he had got about 20 paces from the place. After reproaching Bluebeard with his cruelty, they dragged him back to the spot where he intended to have murdered their sister, and there, stabbing him to the heart with their swords, he expired, uttering the most horrid oaths and execrations. Fatima, who had fallen to the ground at the time Bluebeard quitted his hold of her, still lay in the same situation, insensible, for the appearance of her brothers at the moment she expected certain death had thrown her into a faint, which continued during the whole of the time they were engaged in dispatching her husband. The 2 young officers now turned their attention to their sister, whom they raised from the ground, but she could hardly be persuaded of her safety till they pointed to where Bluebeard lay extended and lifeless. Fatima, on recovering a little, tenderly embraced her deliverers, and the appearance of their sister Anne, who had come down from the top of the battlements, added to their happiness. As all those horrid murders which had been committed by Bluebeard were unknown to his domestics, on whose credulity he imposed by falsehoods which they had no means of detecting, Fatima and her brothers thought the most prudent way to act was to assemble them together and then disclose the wickedness of their late master. By the direction of Fatima, her 2 brothers conducted all the servants to the dreadful scene of her husband's cruelties, and then, showing them his dead body, related the whole occurrences which had taken place. They all said that his punishment was not adequate to what he deserved, and begged that they might be continued in the service of their mistress. As Bluebeard had no relations, Fatima was sole heir to the whole of his immense property, and mistress of the castle, in the possession of which she was confirmed by the laws of the country. She then sent notice to all the families in the neighborhood of the death of her husband, and the horrid proofs of his cruelty were laid open for 2 days to all who chose to inspect them. He was then buried privately along with all the bodies of the ladies he had murdered, and the fatal closet underwent a complete repair, which removed every trace of his barbarity. Soon after this, Fatima gave a magnificent entertainment to all her friends, where happiness was seen in every face, and on this occasion the poor, who were assembled for many miles round, partook most liberally of her bounty. Though possessed of riches almost inexhaustible, Fatima disposed of them with so much discretion that she gained the esteem of everyone who knew her. She bestowed handsome fortunes on her 2 brothers, and to her sister, who was married about 2 months after, she gave a very large dowry. The beauty, riches, and amiable conduct of Fatima attracted a number of admirers, and among others a young nobleman of very high rank, who, to a handsome person, added every quality calculated to make a good husband, and after a reasonable time spent in courtship, their marriage was celebrated with great rejoicings.